WorldDenver talks today with Shadi Hamid. Shadi Hamid is a fellow with the Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World in the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Welcome to WorldDenver Talks.
Hi, thank you for having me.
He is the author of a just published Temptations of Power, Islamicists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East. He's also a correspondent for The Atlantic magazine. Let's get started with kind of a key concept in your book. It's counterintuitive to many of us in the West to think that as countries become more democratic, that they would become more orthodox and conservative. So could you explain for our audience the difference between liberal and illiberal democracy?
Yeah, I think that we as Americans, we have this notion that good things go together, that more democracy means more liberalism, and that reflects our own history where liberalism and democracy went hand in hand. That's the way we tend to see it. But in deeply conservative societies, elected governments have to reflect popular sentiment, and popular sentiment when it comes to Islamic law, gender equality, the role of religious leaders is quite conservative. And nearly all the polling we have shows that in places like Egypt, Jordan, Syria, to different degrees, there is widespread support for more mixing of religion and politics, not less. So if Islamists come to power and they're democratically elected, they have to be responsive to that popular sentiment and also to their own conservative base. And I talk in the book about a Tea Party effect, something we've experienced here in the US, where you have the existence of far-right groups that drag centrist, center-right parties like the Republicans further to the right. So it's not just in the Middle East, but I think you especially see it in these polarized societies where there's a lot of debate about the role of religion in public life. So in the book, I wanted to challenge Americans and say, well, we as Americans like to think that we support democracy, but more democracy might lead to outcomes that we're not fully comfortable with. There's a trade-off there, and it's a thorny question, not just for Americans writ large, but also for policymakers as they decide what to prioritize in their dealings with Middle Eastern countries.
You write in your book that Islamic movements thrive on repression. Can you explain that?
Well, a couple things here. They've been conditioned to repression really for 8 decades in a country like Egypt. They've gotten used to that, and they almost see that as their natural state, this state of opposition, where their backs are to the wall and they're fighting against these repressive regimes. But not just that, I argue in the book that contrary to the conventional wisdom, repression can have a moderating effect on Islamist movements. And we see that over time in countries like Egypt and Jordan, where groups like the Muslim Brotherhood embrace tenets of democratic life. They reach out to secular groups. They democratize their internal organizational structures, but they do that as repression is getting worse. So that was a bit of a puzzle that I was trying to address, and I used that to get into a broader discussion of how Islamist groups evolve over time. And I think it's very important to understand how they respond to incentives and pressures.
So what does that imply for U.S. policy? Does that mean we should support repressive regimes because it keeps the Islamic parties on the moderate side?
What I would argue here is that if there's a tension between liberalism and democracy, if we are in fact as Americans small d Democrats, we have to respect outcomes that we may not be comfortable with. So if Islamist groups are coming to power and they do things on women's rights that we disagree with, or they restrict alcohol consumption, or they segregate the sexes in primary school, things like that, we don't have to like it, but I think the important thing, are Egyptians, Jordanians, Tunisians, whatever it might be, are these decisions that they're supporting through the democratic process? And I pose this question in the book, do Arabs have the right to decide through the democratic process that they would rather not be liberals? Do they participate in elections and respect elections? And I think so far, Islamists have shown that they are committed to the democratic process. So for me, that's the main condition.
Mm-hmm. I recall a conversation that I had with an extremely well-educated Kuwaiti woman. She was a professor with a PhD, and it was just before women got the vote in Kuwait. And she was opposed to that. She was opposed to extending the vote to women, which of course would include herself. And she said when women get the vote in Kuwait, things are going to get worse. How do you explain her view?
Yeah, well, Kuwait's a fascinating example because you had women's organizations during that debate actually arguing against giving women suffrage, which is just mind-boggling when you think about it, you know? So there's almost this question of, are they voting against their interests? They don't even want to have the right to vote in the first place. So you had that situation. And I think even after they were granted the right to vote, in Kuwait and other countries to some extent, you see women actually voting in very large numbers for Islamist groups, which are considered to be less supportive of gender equality. So again, you see this dynamic of, you know, women aren't voting for the secular liberal parties that are emphasizing gender equality, not necessarily, which is really interesting. And if we look at Egypt, for example, as well, there was a very interesting poll, a YouGov poll from 2012, where only 18% of Egyptian respondents said they would support a female candidate for president, right? But you break it down by gender. Only 24% of Egyptian women supported the right of their fellow females to be head of state. Only 24%. So you don't even see a big discrepancy based on gender. By and large, Egyptian men and women aren't comfortable with the idea of female leadership at the highest level. Well, you could say this is false consciousness, cultural attitudes that are very much ingrained in society, but we may have to accept the possibility that we aren't all the same. We don't all go along this linear path towards pro-American liberalism where we all believe in the same things, gender, you know, all of these things that we consider to be very central to liberalism. Again, other societies may decide that they don't necessarily agree. That's not to say that women don't believe that they should have the right to work and have an education. I think you've seen over previous decades that even Islamist parties have embraced the right of women to be educated. There are many Islamist women now who are members of parliament in Tunisia. They're part of the main Islamist party there in Nahda. But they might draw the line at a different place than we as Americans do.
What if a country that respected democratic principles and followed what we would consider appropriate procedures, what if they voted in a direction that really violated the UN Human Rights Declaration?
Yeah, it actually often does happen, not just in the Middle East, but illiberal democracies are something we see elsewhere. I mean, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, it has happened and it happens increasingly. And if we look at the case of Egypt, for example, when Mohamed Morsi of the Brotherhood was elected president and he was overseeing the constitution drafting process along with Brotherhood supporters, there were things in that constitution that some could argue violate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that it doesn't go as far as it should on protections for women and gender equality and things of that nature. Now, the Universal Declaration is interesting because we kind of use it as a benchmark, but we have to pose the question. We call these universal values, but they aren't universally held. If you have a situation where in Egypt or Jordan, large majorities don't agree with certain things in the UDHR, then what do we do about that? What takes precedence? This document or the will of the majority in these countries? That is a real tension. And people can come to different conclusions. There are people who would say that liberalism is the ultimate good, and there has to be a strong liberal foundation that every country should be based on. The problem with doing that now is it's very hard to go to Arabs and say, well, actually, you know, Fareed Zakaria wrote this book, and he thinks that you guys should focus on liberalism first, and then you can worry about democracy later. No one's going to go for that, because democracy as an idea has become such an uncontested normative good. Yes. Everyone says they believe in this, and they want it right away. They want to vote for their own representative. So I think it's very difficult now to kind of say, well, what's the perfect sequencing in this ideal world? 1, 2, 3, what are the prerequisites for democracy? In the real world, it doesn't like that, because people want the right to vote right away, even if that means they might vote for illiberal groups.